Welcome, everyone, to this discussion around the new report from GMF on the security implications of Chinese infrastructure investment in Europe. I'm Andrew Small, a fellow on GMF's Asia program. We have the three main report authors with us who will speak shortly. Mareike Ohlberg from GMF, Jonas Parello-Plesner from the Alliance of Democracies and GMF, and Dario Cristiani from the Italian Institute of International Affairs and GMF. We will also hear in a moment from Colonel Ørjan Askvik from the Ministry of Defense, Norway, who kindly provided funding support for the research that fed into this report. But just by way of a few introductory comments, the authors of this report did a few different things with their analysis. First was to look at the Chinese investment playbook through an in-depth analysis of specific countries and subregions, as you will read from the report, which is now available. The second was to try and put what China was doing in its local political context and to disentangle what was at times, and particularly, as you will see from Dario's chapter in the Italian case, sometimes a level of public hype from what has actually played out on the ground in some of these countries, but also conversely to try to highlight some of the risks that have not always been as fully appreciated. The third was really to try to look at the new landscape China now faces in Europe. We've gone through a number of different phases running back to the Eurozone crisis of kind of cycles of Chinese investment and responses to it. And I think, as you'll see in the report, there's no question that now across the board, China is dealing with a more skeptical political environment and a sharpened set of legal tools and scrutiny mechanisms on the European side. The authors also tried to evaluate the lessons learned from the last few years, particularly from the 5G experience that was really at the intersection of the technology, economic, security and values questions that Europe and everyone else is really trying to navigate at the moment. And finally, the authors with this report tried to answer the question of what happens next and what should happen next, particularly with many of the new screening arrangements still in their very early days. How do we move beyond a set of reactive policies, belatedly adapting to some of the Chinese practices of the past, and instead develop the capacities to get out in front of some of the shifts that we see underway on everything from the Chinese government's approaches to self-reliance and building dependencies to its handling of the Chinese tech sector. Now, we're holding this discussion today on the same day as the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council meeting, where these questions are a major focus. And obviously for the German Marshall Fund, cooperation transatlantically and with other like-minded partners is going to be an important part of any response to this. But I'll leave it to our speakers today to detail what they think that should amount to. And finally, just before I hand it over, we have a really exceptional group of participants joining this event. It's honestly one of the best lists I've seen and indicative of how much interest there is in the subject. We should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Some of our speakers as well are ready to zap in quickly on the Q&A on the chat, even when they're not going to be answering verbally. So be ready to jump in with your questions in the chat box as soon as we get going. But let me begin by handing over to Colonel Askvik from the Ministry of Defense to make a few opening remarks before we go to the report authors. Colonel Askvik.
Certainly, thanks a lot. And on the behalf of the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, I'd like to thank the GMF for this important contribution to increasing the knowledge on this important topic for all of us. I think we've all seen in our countries an increasing knowledge and an increasing focus on exactly this intersection, the implications of the investments in infrastructure. We've been through the 5G, we've been through several other incidents in Norway, and the prime mover is China. We're also seeing some Russian attempts to invest in infrastructure, but the prime mover is China. And I think the introduction is pretty sharp and straight on. I think we're seeing increased knowledge, increased awareness of the implications that this carries with it. And certainly for our country, it is just 5 years ago, 2016 and 2021, we've moved quite a bit from more of a naive approach to this to a more mature. I wouldn't say that we've reached maturity on this level, but we have an increased awareness, an increased focus, and increased the cross-department processes that are necessary to deal with these issues. We've been through a pandemic that's been hard. Our MOD has a small research fund. We've had several delays, including this one, but we're very happy to see that the report came through, and it represents topics of great concern, and I believe your findings and contributions will contribute to valuable knowledge in this area, and I'm looking very much forward to your presentation today. And with that, thank you on behalf of the Norwegian MOD.
Thanks very much, Colonel Aspvik, and thanks again to the Ministry for your support for this report. We're going to begin with Mareike, who is going to introduce her chapter and analysis on Germany and its neighbours. Mareike, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'll try to stick to my 10 minutes. I'm going to mainly focus on Germany, which as a dominant economic actor in Europe is of import in this. When it comes to infrastructure investments, we often talk about, Central and Eastern Europe or about Southern Europe and less so about Germany. But Germany has been very consistently among the top destinations for Chinese investment in general in Europe. And the topic of this report very much applies to Germany as well. Occasionally, I might veer into some comparisons with some of Germany's neighbors, but the main focus is going to be on Germany for this as well. So three points I'm really going to try to drive home in this very short selective presentation of material. One is that, yes, there have absolutely been very substantial changes and a very steep learning curve in how we've been dealing with Chinese investments. Two, despite all this, we do continue to have some blind spots or some areas, especially with hard physical infrastructure, where I think we need to take a much closer look, and we haven't looked closely enough. And third, the point that I want to make is we need to continue to adjust this to the evolving Chinese strategy. And this was very much a point we also made in the report as a whole. So first, overall, the same trend in Germany as in much of Europe, investment as a whole peaked in 2016, 2017, and has decreased since then, at least the known amounts, and as a whole, in part due to increased scrutiny in Europe, and in part due to developments in China that also have an impact here. So we did not see a COVID uptick as some people were scared. In terms of investment screening, Germany, as is well known, has kind of taken a leading role in Europe. Germany had what people refer to as its KUKA moment, when the robotics company was purchased by a Chinese company, and that basically shocked Germany. And since then, we've seen multiple changes to investment screening on an almost annual basis. The last one, as is also known, in May 2021. And these investment screening mechanisms have actually been used to block purchases. And Germany has, of course, also pushed the EU to introduce screening regulation, which has now happened, and more countries that previously didn't have this are now following through. Now, some of these high-tech investments and some of the investments that are looked at here have relevance from a security perspective, but we mainly did look at infrastructure. So we mainly looked at three areas of strategic infrastructure, one being ports and airports, one being electricity, both grids and electricity generation per se, and the third one is digital infrastructure. And here I just really want to highlight some of the findings. I won't be able to go into all of it, that basically drive home the point that overall things have improved a lot and we're pretty good at checking things. But there are some mismatches between how closely we sometimes look into perhaps high-tech, advanced high-tech that could have defense relevance, and physical infrastructure where this is perhaps sometimes overlooked. So the first area that I looked at for this chapter was ports and airports. And if you've been following this debate, there's been recently some concern about, a planned investment in a port terminal in Hamburg. And there has been concern in Belgium about investment in the airport of Liège by Alibaba. And for this, we looked at some of the less prominent examples of these physical port and airport infrastructure investments. And what we found was everything from bad for the economy, possibly fraud, but harmless, to quite, in my opinion and the opinion of other experts, potentially quite serious security concerns. So first, we have cases such as, a former Soviet airport that is essentially, in a way, the German version of Fire Festival. I don't know if you've seen the documentary on Netflix about a fairly big disaster where basically the investors, where there was quite a concern with some fraudulent behavior. We had one case where the airport was bought up by a Chinese investor who made very big claims and who said he was going to invest and all. And this was done to save local jobs. And then he basically disappeared, and now he's gone. The airport is bankrupt. And both the German government and the Chinese government are looking for the investors. So in this case, it's obviously bad for the local economy. The local government didn't manage to save the jobs they wanted to save by getting Chinese investments. But in terms of security implications, it's fairly harmless. But then on the other hand, we do have cases such as the Jadeweser port in Wilhelmshaven, which was sold fairly quietly to a Chinese state-owned enterprise in early 2020, which is the company China Logistics is an SOE itself and its parent companies. They don't have massive ties to the People's Liberation Army, but they have worked with the PLA. They have worked with the PLA in the South China Sea and have those military ties. The port was leased for 99 years. This is quite common. And it's basically, it's 6 kilometers upstream of one of the main naval base commands in Germany. So any ship that's gonna leave the naval base command is gonna pass this Chinese-owned port. And even though it's even if it's not an immediate security risk, there may be nothing going on right now, it is a long-term decision with long-term ramifications. And as such, I think here is definitely an area where we should focus more closely on what are other potential ramifications here. We have a similar case, but less extreme, in the port of Gdynia in Poland, where a Hutchison, the Hong Kong shipping, the Hong Kong company, also purchased terminals within fairly close range of military installations. It's less extreme because the Hong Kong-based company, and it's not as obviously, you don't have to pass that port all the time if your military leaves, but it's a similar issue where I think we could all look a little more closely. So in these cases, frankly, I think local economic concerns simply prevailed, and there was, outside of, I think, expert circles, very little debate about this. In larger terms, one of the main concerns that people I spoke to that they did raise was, of course, the idea that Chinese investments at the local level in Germany or other countries could also have ramifications in the long term, that local governments could, in the interest of retaining Chinese investments, could be put under pressure and could put in turn the federal government under pressure. And so far that hasn't really happened, but because of the federal structure of the German state, there is some potential that this could have some ramifications. Now, very briefly, I want to go into the electricity debate and the digital infrastructure debate. In terms of electricity, a large part of BRI investment has been in electricity, the grid, or in renewable energies. I think this is a topic where some other people are much better informed than I am. And I do feel that there is generally a fairly high awareness of the risks of losing access to this critical infrastructure. In 2018, Germany blocked a sale to a Chinese company via Belgium through unconventional means. This is fairly well known, by asking its own bank to buy the stake instead, because at that time the investment screening mechanism wouldn't have caught that, but they were aware of it and they acted. There is also, both in Germany and especially in the CEE countries, Central and Eastern European countries, quite a bit of awareness that a lot of both renewable energy companies and actual parts of the electricity network have been bought up, and there is a backlash against this, quite a bit of awareness. But yeah, the three risks here: one, loss of proprietary technology, particularly with renewable energies. There's awareness of that. In terms of control over the grid, there has been quite a bit of backlash. And in terms of overall, the fact that Chinese companies own part of this in terms of energy security, I think there is one, awareness, and two, I think there are bigger problems with regard to energy security in this particular case, in the German case, Russia. If you're thinking about, large parts of your energy supplies being controlled by a potentially hostile country, Russia is the bigger concern than Germany. Finally, very briefly, the digital infrastructure debate in Germany has been, and in other parts of Europe, has been very much obviously dominated by the Huawei and 5G debate. When I looked into this, there were some other cases where I thought, I'm a little surprised this hasn't gathered more attention, such as a Hong Kong Hutchison again owning a telecommunications company in Austria and other European countries with fairly large market share in Austria. So compared to Huawei, that there hasn't been much debate at all, surprised me a little bit. But the main issue here that we looked at was the Huawei debate. And here it looked initially like Germany might actually take a lead on the Huawei and 5G question, but instead, due to a number of factors, including the fact that Huawei is already tied quite closely with our local telcos, essentially the can was kicked down the road. With the new law of April 2021, it's fairly likely that Huawei will probably not be in the network, but in a way the can was kicked to the next government that's going to come, who knows when. So there was some flexibility to give the new government some ways to decide. I do think that with the most recent developments that we've seen on the Huawei saga, including the fact that the Chinese state has all but come out and admitted that it has engaged in hostage diplomacy with Canada over the Huawei CFO, I do think that should give us all more pause to pay more attention to that. I'm going to close here because I think I am running out of time. But just to sum up again, overall, a lot has moved, and by any standards, the learning curve has been extremely sharp, and there's been a lot has happened. Again, some blind spots that I really do think we need to revisit, such as Yada visa plot, some other things do remain, and we need to have that debate about what is actually security relevant and why those things haven't been factored in yet. And then third, and I'll close with that, as the Huawei saga showed, and as Chinese economic policy in general shows, we need to continually adapt to what is happening in China, what is happening between the party and both SOEs and private companies on the ground in China, and see where the strategy is moving and keep our options open to refine our own screening mechanisms to make sure we stay up to date on that. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to the debate later.
Thanks, Mareike. Very quickly, just before, don't vanish. Before we go to Dario, I just wondered, I mean, we're in the week after the German elections, without going into involved analysis on possible coalitions, how far do you think the landscape on this is likely to shift afterwards on these questions? Did we push the limits of the position domestically in Germany on the investment screening processes? I mean, how do you see this kind of coming out on the German and European side with Merkel gone, or not yet, but soon?
So, with this particular issue in mind, whether we're going to refine investment screening on that, I think that remains to be seen, because there is the sense that we have already done a lot. There is the sense from some corners that we have possibly done too much, even though I would obviously disagree with that and think in some areas we haven't. But by and large, I guess by and large, what we are going to see is probably, we're not going to see a super hawkish Germany that's going to come out super hawkishly on China. But I do think what we are going to see is a continued shift in the direction we have already seen towards demanding more hard lines, and also eventually, gradually, slowly, no radical moves, making some actual measures follow that will actually be more, or will be perceived as more hawkish on China, simply because one, we don't know the exact constellation of the German government. There's obviously coalition talks ongoing, and a lot of different possibilities at this point. But two of the parties that are likely to be in the government, the FDP, the Liberals, and the Green Party, have come out fairly hawkishly on China in the past, because they also discovered this as an issue to position themselves vis-a-vis the government. But so they are likely going to be involved in some form or another. And while opposition positions are different than your positions when you are in government, you might make some adjustments to them. I don't think they're going to completely backtrack and reverse themselves. And the second factor, I think, why I think we're going to see generally a movement, again, no radical movement towards hawkishness, but some continued movements in that direction, is that in a way, the Angela Merkel herself is she's no longer going to be the chancellor. She did build up a fairly strong position. It's what happens when you're in government for 16 years. You have a certain position where you can make certain foreign policy decisions from the chancellery. And that, I think, is not going to be the case any longer. So an issue such as Huawei, that is not a decision that can be made in the chancellery any longer. And the same is true for a lot of other decisions, where you're going to have more involvement from the ministries again, and no longer the line that was taken by Angela Merkel. So I think these are the things that, regardless of what the ultimate outcome is of which government we're going to see, we can say for sure. And that points towards this gradual move into a slightly more confrontational direction.
Thanks very much, Mareike. Dario, if you can materialize, Dario's chapter on Italy and the wider Mediterranean. He'll give some comments on that.
Yeah, okay. I was having trouble to turn on my cam, so here I am. Well, yes. So I will try to stick to my 7 minutes. Then we have enough time, I guess, for questions and answers later. So first of all, thank you to Andrew for actually involving me into this project. So why Italy, and why focusing primarily on Italy? Because of the great deal that was represented by Italy joining formally the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, and the focus of this chapter is very much on how first this happened and how the outcomes were not those that many, both in Italy and China, expected, for a number of, I would say, structural reasons, but also because of a number of developments that emerged connected to the pandemic and to a changing mood, particularly in Italy, regarding this relationship. So China in the Mediterranean is, we can say, sort of very powerful newcomer, in the sense that until 15-20 years ago, China was not part of the security equation of the Mediterranean. It used to have relations with some countries, I would say Algeria, Egypt, but it was just from over the past 20 years that the Chinese presence started growing in the area, primarily because China realized that the Med the Mediterranean was an essential element of for its geo-economic projection. So there was no, there has never been the ambition, at least to these days, of China to play a more political role in the area, but the geoeconomic influence of Beijing has become particularly significant both in southern Europe, in the Middle East, and more in North Africa. However, there has never been, from the Chinese perspective, a sort of coherent view on the Mediterranean, in the sense that they still perceive the Mediterranean as being divided in regional subgroups, and they would deal with these regional subgroups directly. So they don't see them as a part of a coherent bloc, let's say. Then, looking at this region from this perspective, we can see that China actually started becoming more and more involved in the early 2000s, when it started this process of trading and investing abroad. Then in the Middle East and North Africa, there were a number of events that pushed China to be a bit more present, especially, I would say, the Arab Spring, that represented, in the short term, it was a problem for China, because China invested in the relationship with some of the countries that were hit by this wave of revolutions or revolts. Depends very much on how we want to see them, and also in the same period there was this rising Chinese interest in investing in a number of European countries that were facing a number of economic problems following the global financial crisis of 2008-2011. So, for instance, Greece, but also Italy. So why I'm stressing this point now? Because I want to stress the fact that the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 was not the beginning of this greater interest of China for the region, but this interest was already there. And this interest was already there in regard to Italy as well. And this is a very crucial point, because especially when observing the logics of the Chinese engagement with Italy in, for instance, in their investment strategies on seaports, we can see that this strategy predates the signing of this agreement with of Italy formally joining the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019, which means that the type of hype that this agreement had in the transatlantic community in 2019 was somehow exaggerated, in the sense that the interest of China for Italy was there already for a few years, and there was this sort of ambition to somehow shift the quality of this engagement, to make it deeper. But the reaction of Italy's historical allies, especially the United States, and then a number of changes that occur in the Italian political landscape in the following months, changed a little bit the course of action. So, looking at that period, there was at that time in Italy, there was the first populist government in the history of the country, a coalition government made by the Five Star Movement and the League. The fact that there was a populist government doesn't necessarily mean that Italy was changing the course of its foreign policy. And indeed, if we go and look at what Italy was doing, there wasn't a real change with the past. But in some cases, some members of this coalition, they were pushing to promote a number of changes in some specific areas, and China became crucial in this sense because there were some members of the government. I can mention the former Undersecretary for Economic Development, Michele Geraci, who are well known in Italy for being very close, let's say, to China. And then at that time, the former Minister of Economic Development, Luigi Di Maio, who is now Italy's Minister of Foreign Affairs, he also was looking for let's say, a policy action that would characterize his presence in the government. And this decision of joining the Belt and Road Initiative was actually this, let's say, this tool, this political tool to show some sort of discontinuity with the past. Then we also must take into account the economic and financial element attached to it. And I think this is an important factor to take into account when observing the cleavages inside the Italian polity regarding China. I keep stressing that in Italy, we don't really see inter-party, a sort of like different approach to China between parties. But within each major Italian party, we can find a group of politicians who are pro-China and a group of politicians who are against China. And usually this difference, this cleavage exists because of ideology, but also because of the different connections with the territory that some of these politicians they might have. And I think in the report, it's when analyzing the case of Taranto, this sort of tension is very evident between the local politicians, in that specific case linked to the Five Star Movement, who were desperately looking for investments for the city, and the logics and the needs of Italy as a transatlantic ally to keep China away from a place like Taranto that is considered essential in terms of which has a strategic value for Italy and NATO. This logic can be applied also to the investments in other seaports. Like in the report, we discuss in depth the cases of Trieste and Genoa, because they were two seaports that were part of all the agreements of the Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding. But we can see this tension at play also in places like Ravenna, for instance. So there is always this element, this idea that China is fundamental for as an economic partner, but that it can become a problem in terms of alliances or when it comes to geostrategic and geopolitical issues. And I will start. I will conclude now. And so after the signing of the Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding, there was this this idea that Italy was somehow ready to shift alliances. Some of us, I wrote a piece back in the days explaining how this was very much in line with some freedoms that Italy used to take when it comes to foreign policy things. So this shift never actually happened. And on the contrary, there has been a significant change in the mood that the Italian political world has had toward China. Why I'm stressing the Italian political world? Because in terms of public opinion, China has received some sympathy over the past 2 years, especially in the beginning of the pandemic period, when there was this perception that European and transatlantic allies were not doing much to help Italy, and instead China invested heavily in this public diplomacy actions, showing that it was providing material, masks and other material needed for Italy to tackle the pandemic. Then this public diplomacy action went a little bit too far, and this started creating some problems, especially with some members of the new government, because in the meantime, there in September 2019, the populist government of the League and the Five Star Movement collapsed, and basically the League was replaced by the Democratic Party. That, as a party, heir of the Communist Party, although we should, I don't have time to explain this passage now. Paradoxically, especially because of some of its players like Lorenzo Guerini, the current Minister of Defense, or Enzo Amendola, who was at that time the Minister of European Affairs, they possibly represent the most pro-Atlanticist players in Italian politics. So on the one hand, there was this change in mood that was reinforced by the government of Mario Draghi, as we have also seen with the changes regarding the screening, the golden powers and the screening mechanism for Chinese investment. Then there was a disappointment for the bad results in terms of trade and economic development linked to the memorandum of understanding. And here I'm not talking about the dynamics during the pandemic. Here I'm talking about the first data that were released just before the pandemic regarding the immediate impact of the memorandum of understanding. And then there was also the element of the mounting pressure coming from the United States that made clear that that for them, the idea of Italy being such an active player in when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative was considered to be a major problem. So all these elements together, they created the conditions for Italy to change course, which doesn't mean that Italy will formally withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative. I don't really think this is something that is going to happen. But 2 years into this agreement, we can see that the agreement did not contribute to the development of Chinese-Italian relations in the way that Beijing and some people in Rome wanted, and that this kind of mood is likely to be there for the foreseeable future, which means, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was considered very pro-China, and now instead he's seen as a staunch Atlanticist, he said often that China is a commercial partner and that's it. So I will stop here, and then happy to answer all the questions you might have.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Dario. And I see there's already a good list of questions coming in. Please already start firing them into the Q&A box so that the speakers can sort of deliberate on them, in some cases even preemptively answer them. But our final speaker now is Jonas, as we move from Italy to the north of Europe. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and great to be on. Thanks for the great cooperation on doing this report together. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm happy to see that there are so many people in the room today, over 200 I can see, and counting. So that's great. I wrote about the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark in the Kingdom of Denmark construction, so including Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And I basically want to sort of leave you with 3 points from the chapter. You're of course very welcome to read it. So I will therefore only take out some main findings so that this doesn't become an audiobook of it. But so the first one is really that you have a Nordic disenchantment with Chinese investments. You basically have Nordic countries that are normally extremely sort of pro-free trade, open, seeking investments, and that was also the basic approach to China, as it was in general with trade with China. But you basically see from like 2010, when Volvo, the Swedish car makers, was bought up by Geely, a Chinese company, and at that time kind of heralded as a sort of new opening in Europe for Chinese investments, to now where in all three Nordic countries you see a sort of ban on Huawei in 5G, and all countries signed up to the Clean Network Initiative that was launched by the US, actually by the previous US administration, the Trump administration. So that's sort of a pretty marked shift in these countries coming from that. And why has that happened is the second thing I'll turn to. One is that economic and investment has increasingly also been seen as national security. Then there's been the change, of course, in the continuous hardening of the US position on these issues. I mean, I would say if we look at Huawei, for example, if we go back, it was actually already in the US itself under Obama that some of the first sort of banned through the CFIUS, the screening happened. But this has, of course, been strengthened a lot under Trump and is ongoing under Biden as well. So the US posture, of course, also matters. The fact that NATO now increasingly takes up infrastructure, digital and other areas as part of sort of the resilience of NATO, and also sees this sort of through a security prism matters. EU change also matters, that EU from also being very only open arms to China has changed its posture, particularly from 2019 with the policy that also labels China as a systemic rival, with the fact that EU has introduced investment screening legislation. So you've also seen that in all the Nordic countries, that Denmark most recently introduced investment screening. You have it in Norway. Sweden has legislation that's coming up, where before you would basically be sort of completely open to business, open to any investment. Now there's a different look at particularly state-driven investment, and that's of course again where China sort of looms large in the picture. Then, of course, this is also driven by internal developments in China. The fact that China, with its China Made in 2025 plan, is increasingly trying to make the same products, and in particular in high tech, where Nordic countries have strongholds, and are doing it with the help of state subsidies and a lot of other tools that are basically not sort of a free trade. And then finally, but not least, of course, the increasing Chinese pressure and being kind of tough and sometimes rude in the Nordic countries has not helped either, what some has labeled the wolf warrior diplomacy. We've seen it most strongly recently with Sweden, where the now outgoing, I think he left this week, Chinese ambassador to Sweden has been summoned over 40 times to the Swedish MFA because of his different threats to into the Swedish sort of public debate, and that has also been one of the factors in that Swedish view of China has plummeted, so that 80% now hold a sort of quite negative view of China that some polls show. So all of these have been sort of part of the picture of why we see this sort of market change, that the sort of Nordic fairy tale disenchantment with Chinese investments. Where do we go to next would be my third point. I mean, the fact that the Nordic countries have now introduced investment screening might just be a smaller step in a sort of bigger picture. If we look particularly at the US-China tech divide, I mean, some often point to the US when you talk about this. I think it's important to start first point at China. This happened in 2009 when China decided to decouple from the global internet and sort of shut out a lot of Western companies from the Chinese market and basically built their own system inside the Great Firewall. But that is, of course, something that's going to continue to be a point of discussion. And the US is also increasingly, particularly first and foremost on tech decoupling from China. So I think Nordic countries will be faced with that the investment screening was almost sort of the response to yesterday's skirmish, that the next questions will be around university exchange, on the tech sector, not just investments, but also cooperation. What limits are there also with working together with China on a host of other issues where it could impact human rights? Is your technology being used in Xinjiang, for example, where the Chinese government is oppressing the minority Uyghurs? So I think all these things looking forward will be something that it's not just a done deal for with the change that's happened in the Nordic countries on investment screening, but something that will touch a lot of other topics going forward. And then I think the Nordic countries are still kind of scratching their head on how to be a free trader in a China world where China has upended a lot of sort of the rules on free trade by joining the WTO, but then by basically following its own system. And I think for the ones that are a member of the European Union, so Denmark and Sweden, Finland in particular, there's also the question of how they position themselves in an EU that's now without the UK, that had this sort of classical also free trading position, and a much more French-dominated EU with where the response to many of these is kind of industrial policy. This means Europe needs to sort of make national champions or European champions that can sort of match the Chinese. I think the Nordic countries are still somewhere maybe that resonate with what European Commissioner Mareike Ohlberg talked about in a quote when she said, "We want to beat China, but we want to beat China not by becoming China," meaning that if we become as state-driven and as sort of mercantilist, maybe then we might actually lose also some of our sort of values in the process. So I think with those kind of parting words, I will open it to, because I can see the questions keep coming in, and I think it's important to get to that part of it. But once again, read the report, and Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Jonas. So, I mean, we can go almost immediately to you, because the first question that came in, even before we were sort of in the thick of things, was from Han Shen, asking what the similarities and differences between the German and American approach when it comes to reviewing Chinese investments lately are. Mareike, if you're able to jump in on this as well, but from the final points you were making, Jonas, as well, Vestager is, of course, over for the meeting right now in Pittsburgh. I wondered if you might comment on how this is now moving with the Biden administration more broadly, aside from the kind of decisions that have already been taken. This kind of is one of the crux questions transatlantically now, how these approaches are lined up or otherwise. And I wondered if you might just kind of give a comment on how that's shaping up.
Happy to, Andrew. Yes, as you say, it's with the EU-US Trade and Tech Council. It's one of the big topics. I mean, let's be clear a little bit about sort of the initial differences. The US has had the CFIUS systems for years, so it's a system that's been practiced over a long period. So there's an interagency process that, you know, others in the US might criticize it for different reasons, but still overall it works, and it's been sort of tried for some time. I would say Europe is still in a sort of catch-up phase, and the European legislation is still a hybrid model where EU has some leverage, but it's still mostly in the member states that can do most when it comes to actually blocking an investment. And EU mostly has a say if it's deals that cross borders or has a European funding component into it and so on. So what I really hope that we could be part of this is actually a lot of information sharing with Americans. So definitions on what is a state-driven enterprise, what kind of legal, because all of these things have to stand scrutiny in a court as well, that you could have a company afterwards basically suing in be it Germany, be it Denmark, or any other European countries. So you need sort of solid standards on this. So I think there's a lot of work, but it's very practical, and I would say it's mostly also the Americans giving us sort of I would say good experiences. The fact that they've also to a completely different degree had combine this with their intelligence apparatus of actually getting, I think this is a component that's also been relatively missing, and a lot of places in Europe we don't even kind of follow. So you have companies that have really made either a dodgy investment in one country and you've seen that, and then they're like welcomed with open arm in the next country. So I mean, my hope would be that all of that would be, it's maybe a big hope, would be remedied, and there would be a much stronger transatlantic cooperation on this investment screening.
Thanks, Jonas. Mareike, did you want to say a word specifically on the German dimension of that question?
I don't think I have that much to add, because Jonas has basically already, you know, talked about the crux of this. The US is far ahead on this. The US has long had a lot more of an intrinsic motivation to avoid certain dual-use technology falling into Chinese hands. And of course, now Europe, including Germany, is catching up on that. In the German case, with a bit of a focus, I do think, on industrial policy, which, as we, you know, stated in the report, is not necessarily wrong and is not necessarily a problem based on how China is acting. But it's rather difficult to compare the two, because the US has quite different instruments still at its hands and has had them for much longer. So and also has quite different priorities. So they're really quite different, but the changes in Germany itself have been, again, quite substantial given the short time frame.
So the other sort of big issue that has come up that is sort of immediate jumping off point for this is AUKUS. Before we go into some of the specific questions, question from David Camru: has the announcement of AUKUS changed views of relations with China in the European countries discussed? I think given how prominent this has been in the last couple of weeks, it might be quite useful if people could just kind of comment on the aftermath of this. We have seen an effect. In principle, the Trade and Tech Council, for instance, almost didn't go ahead. There are questions about dynamics with the FDA with Australia. A number of meetings are being cancelled right now with the Australians. I wonder if people might just comment. Jonas, also, you might have the additional French flavour to your thoughts on this too, but perhaps if people can, I mean, this has been kind of, this has clearly affected some of the transatlantic dynamics as well as the view on potentially relations with China. So if each of you could just give your kind of quick thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Was that me you called on, Andrew, with the
half French? First.
Yes, I think I will be a quite bad French on this, so sorry, David Camru, who asked the question. I've been at the École Nationale d'Administration, which is also now being disbanded. So and because I think I mean, yes, I think the way the US did it with the short notice, the way that France was not notified, all of this was like sort of bad handling between allies, and the fact that it happened to coincide with the day that the EU actually launched its Indo-Pacific strategy, where France has been, among other countries, a sort of leading voice for getting EU to take a position on that. All of that I can agree with. But if we look at Australia's decision, bottom line, I think what has happened since 2016 to 18, when they made these agreements, is the Chinese has been pressuring them wildly on the economic side, and the Australians are basically now starting to realize they could stand in a sharp situation in the South China Sea or somewhere else in the region, and they would work with one partner, the US. So what they really want to be linked in with the US, that's, I would say, completely understandable. And perhaps also like the French and German somewhat mixed attitude to China of both being a little tough in the EU setting, but at the same time also saying we're still open for business, might also have made Australia a little bit sort of worried about, okay, is this really a sort of partners we'll rely on in a sharp situation? So I must also say I kind of understand what has happened to the Australians over the last year and where they're headed, but it was not done in a very sort of nice way. But I do also think we have to sort of swallow our pride, and it would, for example, have been a really, really bad thing to cancel the US-EU Trade and Tech Council, because this is something we want to pick together to set as the free world the standards, in particularly vis-a-vis China's digital authoritarianism. So, and that's a bigger picture that we have to do together.
Dario, Mareike, do you want to comment on how this is kind of played on the Italian and German sides in particular? Go ahead, Dario.
Okay. Well, actually, in Italy, there was not a unified reaction to this, in the sense that, I mean, first, there is a structural problem, which is our relationship of love and hate with Paris, which has always been like, you know, a crucial partner for Italy. And I don't want to exaggerate, but Italian foreign policy has often been linked to the type of relationship we were having with France. So the past 2 years, there's been a clear improvement in Italian-French relationship. So some people express, solidarity for what happened, but at the same time, there are two issues at stake. One is that in the realm of arms sale and the weapons market, Italy still perceives France as a competitor in many aspects, and then I think, and from this point of view, Italy is one of the countries that doesn't want this issue to be to become a European issue, in the sense that that they don't want the EU to be involved. And secondly, I think it relates to the different views regarding strategic autonomy that the two capitals have, in the sense that in Italy there is this mounting perception that instead of being active in an area like the Indo-Pacific, Italy, France, and other European countries should be not only more active, but more effective in the European neighborhood, so to show the added value that this activism can give to the transatlantic partnership. So in some circles, there might be this idea that, okay, this was the proof that in the Indo-Pacific, we are considered to be not so essential. So let's focus our limited resources on the Sahel, on North Africa, on the Middle East, and let's show our partners in Washington, London, and in other parts of the world that we can actually be this effective actor in our neighborhood, and we leave other people, other countries doing the job in the Indo-Pacific area. So,
Mareike, another competitor for the original submarine deal?
Just very shortly. I mean, I'm not a representative German, so I shouldn't be speaking on behalf of Germany. Again, I largely, it's not definitely not going to shift the attention of Europe necessarily towards the region. If anything, it has, I think it has, of course, complicated matters, but like Jonas, I think matters were complicated to begin with when you look at the French and German position vis-a-vis China, and when you look at the Australian motivation here. So I'm also not one to take sides. All I'm saying is, yeah, I've been watching it. It's been a pity to watch some of that, you know, some of what has happened in the aftermath of this. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to put it behind ourselves and move on as best as possible. Yeah, that's it for me. And I do think we have a lot of questions piling up. So
indeed. So one, I'm going to keep skipping around with some of these questions, and thanks for the written answers as well, which people are free to elaborate on. But on, I wondered whether it might be possible to jump in briefly on the Kai, Heinrich Kreft's question on the Kai. Is it dead? Is there a future? We can also straw poll people on this, but if someone wants to give a more elaborated answer to that.
I mean, I can give it a shot. I can't look into the future. I usually say it's not dead until I have buried it myself. That said, I don't think it's, I mean, it's been put on hold. And we do have a situation then where Angela Merkel, who was like one, you know, Germany being one of the driving forces behind it, she is now out of office. There is definitely a lot of anger in the European Parliament still. That's not going to go away. They have tied it to certain conditions. So I don't think it's impossible that somebody might try to quietly bring it back. But I think the overall conditions for that are rough. Because again, there was quite a bit of backlash. And the other thing is that I don't really think that the overall atmosphere, something that would be conducive to, you know, quietly reintroducing it in some form after China makes some concessions. The overall atmosphere is simply not like that right now, where, you know, I think there is going to be more confrontation. I don't really see a lot of public Chinese concessions. With parliamentary involvement, those concessions would now have to be reasonably public. So I think it is, I think I'd be a little more surprised if it were to come back than if it were not to come back. And at least it's off the table for quite a while.
Now I see Dario jumping in on Julia's question about organized crime in North Africa and a few of these things. One and Jonas on one of the others. One that people might comment on is Dario Cristiani's point about internal needs on the European side. The report does indeed talk about third countries and the European external infrastructure offer, now called Global Gateway. Is there a more serious infrastructure finance offer needed inside to member states? Are we in? Is that sufficient? Do we still face the kinds of pressures on financing needs from China? How, you know, given the new fiscal deals and financial instruments that have been agreed, are we in a much better place than we were when we were dealing with the rounds of investment that we had during the Eurozone crisis? I wonder if anyone might offer thoughts on this question. This is a remarkable reticence. Dario, I'm going to poke.
No, yeah, but I was actually answering Julia, so I was.
I'm
okay.
sorry to break your. The
yeah, no, because it was quite a long answer.
I mean,
so
Italy has, of course, been one of the kind of crux countries on this question, more so than and the Med. I mean, was in a sense the kind of the questions around the need for additional financing from China during the Eurozone crisis, or the perceived need for additional financing, was acute then. And I think the question that was posed was whether, rather than just thinking about the external offer, whether enough was still being done for member states on questions around infrastructure finance. I'd be interested what your perception, particularly after all the new fiscal arrangements that have been put in place this year in the pandemic response and things. How does that look? I mean, that it was bubbling around in the background with the fiscal deficit in Italy, even around some of the BRI MOU. How do you see that picture now, for instance, in the Italian case, and perhaps in the Med more generally, insofar as you can stretch to that?
Well, I actually think this is a question more about China, it's more about us as Europeans, in the sense that, is this post-pandemic approach of the EU a one-off approach? So we need to deal with this crisis. We are doing this sort of very timid, like debt mutualization through the recovery plan. And then once this crisis is over, we return to business and austerity as usual? Or is this the beginning of a new phase in which, of course, no one wants to put all debts together and give certain, like, the burden to countries that did not have a role in creating that debt. But does it mean that there is a shift in the EU approach towards investments, towards fiscal policy? Because there has always been, this inconsistency between the fact that we have a common monetary policy, but the fiscal policy is national. So the thing is, when we do, at least in Italian, we do macroeconomics, the first year of political science, they teach us that fiscal policy and monetary policy, usually they go together. So does it mean, and I think the way in which we answer this question might tell us whether some countries like Greece, Italy, might continue to be tempted from this idea of Chinese investments, but also, I think there is a more general issue, and this is very significant in Italy. In Italy, there is always this thing, but China is such a huge market, so we have to be we have to be present there because there are endless opportunities for us. And no one in Italy really understands, or better, they are starting realizing now how this I would call it chimera. I don't really know how to pronounce that in English, of the Chinese market access is pushing Italy to do what the Chinese want without getting what they want in return. So I think if there is a shift in the way European authority see the issues of public investments, fiscal deficits, at least in the short term, I think this is it would be a very powerful instrument to keep the Chinese temptation in check, let's say. If instead there is a return to the austerity obsession and this idea that public investments should always be limited in order to avoid having fiscal deficits, etc. I think the Chinese might use this element, especially with those countries like Greece, Italy. I think even if Spain has never been it's not at the forefront of this movement, still there might be some people or some groups there that might be tempted by this kind of approach, despite all the problems that we have analyzed when it comes to Chinese investments and the deepening of the economic relations with Beijing. Then, shall I keep answering in written to the question on mafia and North Africa, or?
Well, I mean, it might be interesting to, if you're well in, keep going, and we'll pivot back to it if we have time to dig into it
okay.
a bit as well. Jonas, I think, was going to make a comment on this question as well, and then I think also touch on the question that was raised about students and exchanges and things that he'd also raised a little bit in his introductory comments as well. Jonas.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to Aki. Good to see you again for the question. So you mentioned in your question that Japan has introduced investment screening, but now there's an increasing discussion on students and what that means. I would say you've seen that in the US, both on the Trump administration, with taking a sort of China initiative, and particularly by the FBI, also on Chinese researchers in the US. But you've also seen a backlash of some seeing this as basically stereotyping and potentially even sort of blatant racism. In Europe, you've seen it less. I would say in my own chapter with the Denmark case, you had the legislation that was introduced not that long ago. They added kind of in the last instance, they added sort of economic agreement, which could include university corporations. So basically made a slightly broader definition of just like only looking at investments, particularly because there's been raised questions in the Danish case about the 1,000 Talent program, where a couple of investigative journalists have found out that several Chinese researchers that work here in reality also have a job in the Chinese system that they've not declared. And so there's been sort of raised question of that, both on industrial espionage so in several different sort of instances. So I think it's becoming a debate in Europe as well. I would say students is less, at least to my sort of, I would say you most have it with researchers and everything where you're embedded in a system. You both have the industrial element, and then you have the state espionage element if it's researchers that are associated with the Chinese military in one form or the other. With students, that might be less of, I would say, of a sort of worry as such. And there it's more cases of freedom of expression that you have among Chinese students abroad, that increasingly they monitor each other and kind of single out people that, going back to, I think it was in Maryland, there was a commencement speech back in 2017 where a Chinese student that did it spoke about sort of the fresh air of freedom in the US, and she was both her personally and family back home was kind of singled out, particularly on Chinese social media. So those, I would say, are more some of the worries in Chinese student groups abroad than necessarily the same kind of issues you have around researchers. But as a final observation, this is definitely, and that was also one of my parting observations in my chapter, that the fact that there's now increasingly investment screening in most member states in the EU doesn't mean that this is all now settled. It means there are a lot of other issues that kind of open up. If we look at Huawei, for example, that's not in the classical investment. It's a sort of 5G telenetwork auction. So it's regulated by different regulations. And so in the same way, university corporation has its own rules. So each of these areas, and I think what we need to is look comprehensively at our resilience to Chinese state-driven initiatives and how that factor. And then it doesn't matter that much whether it's investment, economic cooperation, university cooperation, but basically how we protect our democratic systems from that.
A couple more questions to cover. So just to take the question from Bridget Fink, what do people use as their best database or resource for maps of Chinese infrastructure investment, either in Europe specifically or generally? What resources did the authors draw on for their work?
I mean, I think the main issue is that oftentimes there are some pretty good maps, but they're quickly outdated because a lot has been moving. But I mean, I've drawn a lot on, you know, some of the work of my former employer, actually, Mareike. They used to have a fairly comprehensive database, and I think it's still updated. Bloomberg has done some mapping, so there are several ones out there. So it's more a question of, you know, how complete is it and how up to date is it? But it's definitely been done before, and there are some pretty good resources out there if people look for them.
There was also a question that answered this as well, but there was also a question that you semi-answered, but that I would just be interested in people's comments on, which was the question around forced labor and labor rights issues. Which indeed was not touched on in the report, but I wondered if anyone might comment. Was it not touched on in the report by people because they didn't think it was actually an issue? Because, I mean, this was a sort of generally an intra-EU report, and these rights were sufficiently guaranteed by existing legislation and adhered to by the Chinese companies, or is this an issue that does need digging into more? I wondered if anyone might comment on that, and Jonas, if you wanted to say a word about the resources that you are drawn on by way of maps. I would agree with Mareike, certainly some of the challenges of some of the databases that I've used for these things. But Jonas, go ahead.
So yeah, shortly on databases, I mean, Rhodium, which also has done this in cooperation with Mareike, I think has been tracking these issues for, and then there are of course country studies. So there's a really good, in my case, Swedish study that tracked from their defense academy. So, but again, as Mareike is saying, often it's a bit piecemeal in different countries, and you sort of join it together. And I hope that will be part of what the investment screening by the EU will also fabricate, is basically a kind of much more sort of comprehensive list, both classified and unclassified among member states on this. And then the second question was what again, Andrew? Was on?
The question was...
labor standards. Yes.
Labor standards, yeah.
Labor standards. Yes, I mean, I didn't look into it, so I cannot say. I would say in the Nordic countries, not that some would say our Polish carpenters are not necessarily treated the way they should, but generally labor standards are kept pretty tightly in the Nordic countries. I wouldn't see that as a big issue and it's not been these labor intensive investments that China has been making. The only area where it could play a little role, but it's still hypothetical, is in the Kingdom of Denmark in Greenland, where there's been this talk of these huge Chinese mining investments in rare earths, and where Greenland has sort of one of the world's second largest deposits sort of after China, and which are completely untapped. None of this materialized, in part also because, which is good, that the Greenlandic government has local government has like strong criteria on environmental standards, on labor standards, and so on. But no matter what, if one of these projects were to materialize with Chinese funding, and you would see in a population that's only 50,000 in Greenland with 3,000 Chinese workers, it would mean a massive sort of change in the local population. And but again, none of this has happened yet. But there are definitely labor standards has been an issue that's been discussed.
Oh, Dario, on this, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Yeah, I was just gonna, sorry, to jump ahead. I was briefly wanted to jump in. So we didn't look at this systematically for this, obviously. The question of labor standards did come up. And some of the works I saw some studies, I think, from regions in Germany where some people actively looked into that for the simple fact that this had been a matter of concerns also on the part of unions, what's going to happen once our employer becomes Chinese because of a takeover or because of some other reason of Chinese involvement. And in this particular study, the conclusion was, no, it hasn't actually eroded labor standards. It was a positive surprise. That said, I do think there's a lot of work that would need to be done more specifically on this on other cases. And it's definitely, I would say it's an area where it's worth keeping a focus on and looking into over and over again in different contexts, because it is depending on on how much people actually look when there is involvement from these Chinese companies, there may be issues arising. So I think it's absolutely fair to keep an eye on it. But in the studies I've seen, their conclusion was we expected it, but it actually didn't happen. So something we need to continue to watch.
Thanks, Mareike. Dario?
So I will, on this, of course, like in my chapter, I didn't focus on this element for two reasons. First, the lack of additional space, and second, it's a topic on which I don't consider myself like knowledgeable enough to delve. And I think this connects to a certain extent to some of the conclusions we have in the report, in the sense that to deal with China, we need to build in Europe a multidimensional knowledge that in some cases not even single countries can have. And for instance, this issue of labor standards might be one of the issues in which we have absolutely to improve this. I want to add something on this because when it's not an issue that has emerged now in Italy, but it started emerging when China was first investing in some of the Italian seaports. And I can give you the example of Naples, because I think that one was very significant. I answered this question in chat regarding the issue of organized crime. I think there might be some connections, just we haven't seen enough evidence. But when China started investing in the seaport in Naples, there was this idea that it was doing so to establish these connections with this network of informal firms working in the textile. And for instance, I don't want to be mean to my country, to my city of origin. I'm from Napoli, but we know that in Naples, that around Naples, there have been these firms working in shoes, textile, etc., in which usually the labor standards are not so high, like there is a lot of informal work, etc. So there was this idea that one of the reasons why China was investing so heavily in the seaport in Naples, it was because of this potential connection with a sector of the Italian supply chain in which the things regarding the controls regarding labor standards were not as significant as in other parts of Italy. And if I'm not wrong, as a reference, there is a chapter of the famous book written by Roberto Saviano, Gomorra, regarding these connections that, okay, there might be some elements linked to organized crime, but I remember that chapter being very interesting regarding this sort of informal globalization, informal global, let's say, like economic movement linked to the fact that the Chinese thought it was in their interest to invest in that part of Italy because in the textile sector, the controls were not so significant and there were these elements. And now I don't really know when it comes to the agreements made for the Belt and Road memorandum, etc., how this specific issue has been regulated. Also because, and this is worth a reminder, the wording of the MOU was extremely generic in all the agreements that were part of this MOU. So there were a lot of like gray areas, gray zones that were supposed to be either agreed upon or debated what this agreement would have developed, let's say. Then there was this question that I was thinking of answering live very quickly about US and the EU. Maybe so I can do that later.
One set. So I mean, it's a good question for everyone to wrap up on now. In fact, I'd like each of you just to give your kind of concluding thoughts, and thanks also for running through and answering so many of the other questions that are typed, and people should kind of go and look at the answers as well if they haven't. If you could just give your concluding thoughts on that question. The transatlantic picture, not just on investment screening, but as the questioner suggests, where are we now on this investment screening, export controls, technology cooperation, industrial? There's a whole series of these things are, you know, as again we in principle see in the discussions today in Pittsburgh, really at the center of these discussions. What is the outlook now on this, and any other concluding thoughts you have on some of the prescriptions in the concluding section as well on what we need to be doing next? And Dario, you go ahead and start this time, and then Mareike, and then Jonas to wrap up. And if you can just each take a couple of minutes.
So the perspective, I think, EU and the United States. I think in the US now there is a way more coherent approach on China compared to just a few months ago. There was this idea that Trump was a very anti-Chinese president, which is an idea that I never, that I always contested, in the sense that I saw him being so transactional that one day he was pro-China in order to deepen like investments relations and trade, and the day after he was anti-Chinese because of the pandemic. I think there is now a greater coherence, consistency between the White House, the Pentagon, State Department, etc. on that. Instead, I don't really see this consistency in Europe. And again, I would put this in the framework of the different perceptions of the Europeans regarding the EU strategic autonomy. I see some countries like Germany and Italy that are way more, I mean, maybe on this Chinese aspect, Italy more than Germany, that wants to give like a real transatlantic response to this, while instead I see that some people in Paris, but also in Brussels, with the High Representative on foreign policy, who, you know, with this third way thing, he went a little bit too far in some occasions. The timing of the strategic dialogue these days is also a little bit peculiar, I would say. So I don't really, I mean, I'm not an expert on EU-Chinese relations, so I don't really want to go too much in detail on that. But I think that indeed there are different views, not necessarily, I think primarily among Europeans, there should be a moment to reflect, and this was also like part of the logic of this report, on how to basically face this challenge in a more consistent way, not only in terms of policy response, but also in terms of understanding the challenge. And as Andrew has underlined in the conclusions of the report, these need to be done in a proper European fashion, because single countries do not really have the capacities and the skills and even the resources in many cases to actually deal with this issue by themselves alone. So I would stop here.
Thanks very much, Dario. Mareike.
Yeah, let me be brief. I think this is a clear glass half empty, glass half full kind of question. You can look at it from either way, from either direction. I think on the one hand, yeah, it's absolutely clear that the United States has different interests, security interests with regard to China than Europe has. And this is something that, you know, Germany and even France, that has the most interest in the Indo-Pacific, is not gonna be on the same page on. And even the allies in the Indo-Pacific of the United States are obviously always going to be ahead of Europe, simply because they are in the region and they are affected by China differently. So they're going to take different positions. On the other hand, so that's like the half glass empty position. On the other hand, change has been quite rapid. Europe has been catching up quite a bit with understanding, gaining a better understanding of who they're actually dealing with in China on a number of issues. There are at least initiatives emerging and consensus emerging on what to do about it. There is a lot more around now than there was a couple of years ago. And quite frankly, and this doesn't make me optimistic, but quite frankly, I do think that China is going to keep doing a large chunk of the work for us by keeping to drive the point home of what the actual problems are. So I do think that is going to keep driving this forward, even though not everybody is on the same page all of the time.
Thanks, Mareike. Jonas, you can wrap up.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, two sort of parting thoughts. Our report was on investments, to sort of, and the link with increasingly with security. I think there, the parting thought is that this is just one component of a bigger picture. So that's also what we are seeing with the US and EU Tech and Trade Council going on these days in symbolically in Pittsburgh. And for me, I mean, I hope that will be part of defining sort of the standard for the free world, so that we see it in that sort of bigger picture. And that would also be my second point, that basically I do hope also with sort of the spat now over AUKUS that we don't see this too narrowly and say, well, we have actually, if we have to choose between some of the smaller disagreements among democracies and transatlantic partners, we still have the bigger picture where we have China's sort of digital authoritarianism right now as actually a real alternative that they can sort of turnkey deliver to fragile democracies that are in doubt what route to go. Then China can sort of deliver an authoritarian package of surveillance and everything. And we have to have a sort of response to that and show that the free world can do it better. So I hope sincerely that that's the direction that we will take over the coming years. Thanks
very much, Jonas. Thanks first of all to our participants for the fantastic questions and for joining us for the discussion today. Thanks to our three speakers and indeed authors for their great work on the report and for, I think, literally answering every single question that was thrown at them today. Thanks also again to the Norwegian Ministry of Defense for your generous support to make the report possible. As you can see, as we can all see from the discussion today, the details on this matter, but the question of Chinese investment and the security implications in Europe obviously touch on so many other intersecting dimensions on this. And as I think you'll see from the conclusions that we touched on a little bit today, there's no individual slice of this that doesn't require thinking about the whole, as Dario also pointed out in his comments. This is really about the capacity for Europe and transatlantic partners to respond even more broadly to the challenges that are underway from China and to get their analysis straight, so that we're not acting purely in a reactive fashion. We're going to be publishing a lot more on this. We've been working on this for a long time. We will continue to do so. I hope many of you who are still on the call now are able to join us for some of these future events. Thanks everyone, and have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.